All right, let's get into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the racial data bill in Massachusetts.
Okay.
You think about a prison system, you think about punishment, right? But imagine if it was actually designed to rehabilitate people.
Interesting.
That was like the radical idea behind this 1972 Correctional Reform Act. It even had these furlough programs where, get this, almost everyone actually came back.
Wow, that's impressive. So what happened? Why aren't we doing that now?
Well, that's what we're going to try to uncover today. We've got all these reports and testimonies, even some firsthand accounts from people like LaToya Whiteside and Mac Hudson.
Okay.
They're over at Prisoners Legal Services, as Massachusetts. And let me tell you, they are fighting hard for this bill.
Yeah, it does seem kind of obvious, right? Like, collect data, figure out if there's a problem with racial disparities in the prison system.
Yeah.
But the fact that we're still talking about this in 2025,
I know.
it really makes you wonder.
It's shocking. We're talking about basic transparency and accountability here.
Yeah.
But there's been so much pushback, especially from the DOC.
Right. And it's important to remember the history here. The DOC, especially under the EOPSS, they haven't exactly been champions of reform.
Oh, and speaking of pushback, get this. When John Boone, the DOC's first black commissioner, was appointed, the Correction Officers Union actually tried to challenge his qualifications.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's like they couldn't handle someone who looked like him being in charge.
Well, it's not surprising when you think about what John Boone himself said about the system. He compared it to, and I'm quoting here, a replica of the pre-Civil War South.
Wow.
He said black prisoners got harsher treatment and way fewer chances to turn their lives around.
It's just unbelievable. And it's not just about the incarcerated people either. Black and brown correctional officers have faced some horrific discrimination too.
Oh, absolutely. There are countless stories.
Yeah. One officer, Morris Charlie, he testified that he was retaliated against just for trying to protect a pregnant coworker from an assault.
It's awful. And Karen Polito, another officer, she was sexually harassed and then forced to take leave while the person who harassed her got promoted. It's like the system protects its own no matter what.
It's a messed up system.
Yeah.
So how does all this connect to the racial data bill? Why should anyone listening even care about this?
Because without data, it's just a bunch of stories. We need hard evidence to prove what so many people are experiencing in the system, and that's exactly what this bill is trying to do.
We're just getting started unpacking all of this. You're listening to The Deep Dive. Stick with us.
And these reports we have, they don't hold back.
Yeah.
They're full of stories and statistics that really paint a bleak picture. We're talking about the DOC just completely ignoring legal mandates, like basic human rights stuff.
Like solitary confinement. It's supposed to be banned, but they just changed the name of the units. Like from TSU to DDU.
Right.
It's still solitary confinement. And they just kept doing it.
It's unbelievable. It's inhumane, and it goes against any sense of due process.
Totally. And it's not even just solitary. It's everything. In 2022, there were over 3,000 reported health and safety violations in these facilities. I mean, think rodent infestations, leaking plumbing, you name it.
It's just unacceptable.
Oh, and there's this unannounced inspection of the Susan Baranowski Correctional Center's kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
It was a nightmare. They found mold, terrible sanitation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how this is even allowed to happen, right?
Yeah.
In a state like Massachusetts.
Yeah. Right. It's shocking.
So all of these findings, it's like why this racial data bill is so important.
Absolutely. It would create an independent body to investigate all of this stuff, collect data on racial disparities and actually enforce the law. Because right now, it's basically the DOC policing itself.
Right, and that's obviously not working.
Clearly not. The racial data bill, it would change that dynamic entirely. It would force them to collect and publish racial data, make these disparities impossible to ignore.
Okay, so it's not just a general go collect some data. No, not at all. The bill gets very specific, creating this whole independent oversight office, making sure they don't just collect data, but they actually publish reports and recommend anti-racism standards and oversee county jails, too. It's really about systemic change.
That's huge. We have to talk about Anthony Garvin's testimony.
Oh, yeah.
He's serving a life sentence and is a really strong advocate for this bill.
His testimony is really powerful. He talks about experiencing racial bias in everything. Disciplinary actions, job assignments, you name it. And there was no one he could go to, no impartial body to investigate those claims.
And there was even that incident with the superintendent at MCI Norfolk, right?
Oh, right.
He threatened the inmate council for just raising concerns about strip searches that were targeting black and brown inmates.
Yeah. It's just unbelievable how deep this goes.
Yeah. The power the DOC has and the lack of accountability, it's just Mind-blowing. And this isn't just one guy's story, right? There's that 2022 report from the Special Legislative Commission on structural racism in Massachusetts correctional facilities, and it backs up a lot of what Garvin's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. That report found systemic racism basically built into the DOC, leading to these racial disparities in everything from healthcare to discipline. And it affects everyone, BIPOC staff members, as well as the incarcerated population. It's a hostile environment all around.
And it really highlights why this racial data bill is so crucial.
Yes, exactly. Without the data, we're just guessing. This bill would give us the evidence to actually dismantle the structural racism that's so deeply embedded in the DOC.
But the thing is, it's not just about what's happening inside the prisons.
Right.
The DOC's failures have a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
On whole communities.
On entire communities, especially communities of color.
Yeah, when people are released from prison, they face all these challenges, finding jobs, housing, getting health care. And the DOC does practically nothing to prepare them for that transition.
It's a failure at every level. And it all ties back into this larger problem of mass incarceration, which, as we know, disproportionately affects communities of color. It's this awful cycle.
So the racial data bill isn't just about exposing the problems, it's actually about creating solutions, right?
Exactly. By requiring this data collection, the bill forces the DOC to actually confront its own biases and start creating more equitable policies. It's about moving beyond just anecdotes and using data to drive real change.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we make sure that data actually translates into changes within the DOC?
Well, that's where the independent oversight body comes in. Remember, they would have the power to investigate complaints, conduct those surprise inspections, even issue subpoenas if they need to. We're talking about real teeth here.
Okay, so they actually have some power to hold the DOC accountable. But will the DOC even cooperate? I mean, they haven't exactly been transparent in the past.
That's a fair point. But the bill has mechanisms built in to address that. It requires the DOC to fully cooperate with the oversight body and give them access to all the information they request. And if they don't, there are sanctions, fines, even potential demotions for DOC officials. So there are real consequences if they try to obstruct the process.
Okay, so there are checks and balances in place.
Yeah.
But what about the Correction Officers Union? They've been a big roadblock to reforms in the past. How does the bill address their concerns?
Well, the bill is designed to be collaborative. The oversight body would include people from different groups, correction officers will be represented, formerly incarcerated people, community advocates. It's about creating a space for dialogue and finding solutions that work for everyone, not about demonizing one group or another.
So it's about bringing everyone to the table and finding common ground. But what about data privacy? Is there anything in the bill to protect people's rights?
Absolutely. The bill includes specific provisions for protecting the confidentiality of personal information. The data can only be used to identify and address racial disparities. It's not just a free-for-all.
Okay, that's good to hear. So collecting data is the first step. What happens next? How do we actually turn that data into meaningful changes in policy?
Well, that's where the oversight body's reporting comes in. They would be required to issue regular reports with their findings, analyze trends, and recommend specific policy changes. And these reports would be public, so there's transparency, and the DOC can be held accountable.
Okay, so there's a path from data to action. But what about enforcement? What if the DOC just ignores the recommendations?
The oversight body would actually have the power to enforce compliance. They could issue warnings, fines, even go to court if necessary to force the DOC to take action. So again, those recommendations have some teeth.
So there are real mechanisms in place to hold the DOC accountable. But stepping back for a second, the racial data bill is important, but is it really enough to tackle this huge problem of systemic racism within the DOC?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a critical step, a huge step, but it's not a magic solution. It needs to be part of a much broader approach. We need cultural shifts within the DOC, more community engagement, and we need to invest in alternatives to incarceration.
So it's about changing hearts and minds as much as changing laws and policies.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to shift those deep-seated cultural issues?
It's definitely a challenge, but there are things we can do. Focusing on staff training, for example, making sure that anti-racism and implicit bias training is part of the curriculum for all DOC employees.
So giving people the tools to recognize and address their own biases. But training alone isn't enough, right? We need a culture where those values are actually put into practice every single day.
You're absolutely right. And that's where leadership comes in. We need leaders within the DOC who are truly committed to racial justice and who foster a culture of accountability, a culture where racism is simply not tolerated, period.
So setting the tone from the top and creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up if they see racism and know that their concerns will be taken seriously. But how do we make sure the community voices are included in this process?
That's where the community council comes in. It's a platform specifically for people from the community, especially those impacted by the criminal justice system, to have a voice and influence policy decisions.
So it's about sharing power and recognizing that communities have a real stake in how the DOC operates.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic. Passing this bill is only the first hurdle. Implementing it effectively is going to be an ongoing challenge.
That's true, but what gives me hope is seeing people like LaToya Whiteside and Mac Hudson, their passion, their expertise. It's going to be key to making sure the bill's provisions are implemented correctly.
And their success with those furlough programs shows that change is possible,
Yeah,
even within a system as stuck in its ways as the DOC.
absolutely. It's a reminder that even small steps can have a big impact.
And the racial data bill is not a small step.
Definitely not. It has the potential to really transform the DOC, make it more just, more equitable, and more accountable to the communities it serves.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but where do we go from here? What can people listening actually do to help make this change happen?
I think the first step is awareness, honestly. We've gone through a ton of info today, but don't stop with this deep dive.
Yeah.
Learn more about the bill itself. It was proposed last session, SD 1054 and HD 3956.
Right.
See what happened to it, why it stalled. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Right. And this isn't just some theoretical policy debate. We've heard real stories about how these failures impact people's lives.
Exactly.
Think about Anthony Garvin facing bias with absolutely no way to fight back.
Right.
This bill is about real people.
Real people's lives, yeah.
And it's about giving them some power.
Exactly. And that's what's so important about the community council this bill would create. It would give folks who are directly impacted by this system a real voice in shaping policies.
Yeah, it's about time. But we've got to get this bill moving again.
Yeah.
What can we do?
Talk about it. Tell your friends and family about what you learned today. The more people understand what's at stake here, the more pressure we can put on our elected officials to get behind this.
Call your reps, call your senators.
Yeah.
Let them know you're paying attention and that this is important to you.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just about passing this one bill. It's about changing the way we think about the whole system.
Right.
True public safety, it comes from giving people second chances, helping them rehabilitate, not just punishment.
It's about putting resources into communities.
Yes.
Supporting people when they re-enter society.
Absolutely.
And breaking that cycle of mass incarceration that just keeps hitting communities of color the hardest.
Exactly. That's what it's all about.
The racial data bill here in Massachusetts, it's a huge step in the right direction.
Huge step.
And everyone listening can actually play a part in making this a reality.
So keep learning, keep the conversation going, and keep pushing for change. That's what these deep dives are all about. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep digging.